Current news and prophecy awakening. This is the DK Foreman Weekly Report. And now, DK Foreman.
All this is unfolding in Iraq and Iran. An African terror group which pledges allegiance to al-Qaeda attacked a U.S. military base in Kenya. One American service member, 2 Defense Department contractors were killed in the attack. Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility. And in the face of these new threats, President Trump is lashing out with new threats of his own, taking on Iran and Iraq, taunting Congress. Cecilia Vega is at the White House with the latest. Good morning, Cecilia.
George, good morning to you. President Trump has long said that he does not want to see endless wars in the Middle East, but this latest threat brings us closer than ever to conflict with Iran, and Democrats want to know why now. They are demanding to see evidence of the White House's claim that this attack on Soleimani was a response to an imminent threat. This morning, President Trump is back at the White House and threatening a swift and potentially disproportionate response if Iran retaliates. But despite the escalating tension, the president and his aides insist killing Qasem Soleimani was the right move.
It's very clear the world's a safer place today. Qasem Soleimani no longer walks the planet.
The president also threatened to target 52 Iranian sites, some of them important to Iran and the Iranian culture, if Tehran strikes back, a potential international war crime and violation of the Geneva Convention. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in damage control mode.
Why is the president threatening Iran with war crimes?
Yeah, we'll behave lawfully. We'll behave inside the system. We always have and we always will.
But just hours later, President Trump saying the exact opposite, telling reporters, quote, "They're allowed to kill our people, they're allowed to torture and maim our people, and we're not allowed to touch their cultural site. It doesn't work that way." The New York Times reporting military leaders were stunned when President Trump decided to kill Soleimani, top brass viewing his death as the most extreme option they presented to the president. And according to the paper, initially, President Trump did not take it. But he changed his mind after seeing news reports of Iranian-backed attacks on the American embassy in Baghdad. Some Democrats lashing out, saying the White House has yet to provide proof of its claim that Soleimani's death was in response to an imminent threat.
Look, everybody knows that Soleimani was a very bad, despicable guy. There's no debate there. But the claim of an imminent threat, they have not supported.
Any military action requires congressional notification, but President Trump now says his tweets should serve as formal notice to lawmakers.
It's President Trump raising his middle finger at the Congress.
Speaker Nancy Pelosi announcing the House will vote on a resolution this week to limit the president's military actions in Iran, calling the attack that killed Soleimani provocative and disproportionate. And President Trump is now threatening Iraq. He told reporters overnight that if the country goes through with this parliamentary vote to end foreign military presence in the country, he will make Iraq repay the U.S. the billions that he says it spent to build an air base there. He says we are not leaving unless they pay us back, and that, quote, we will charge them sanctions like they've never seen before, George.
So, Cecilia, in Congress right now, Nancy Pelosi, you said, is going to be pushing for a vote to forestall any new military action. You have Democrats also continuing to raise questions about that intelligence, whether it really showed an attack was imminent.
Yeah, George, so far the administration has kept its reasoning for this attack on Soleimani classified. Well, now 2 top Senate Democrats are demanding on the White House and the president to immediately and completely declassify the information. We're talking about Chuck Schumer and Bob Menendez. They wrote, quote, "An entirely classified notification is simply not appropriate in any democratic society." George, we also heard the same thing from Pelosi over the weekend. She called this move highly unusual.
Like this, Cecilia Vega, thanks.
Concerns are obviously growing about the threat right here at home. Homeland Security announcing over the weekend the agency is in a, quote, enhanced security mode. Pierre Thomas joins us now from Washington. And Pierre, DHS issuing a very serious bulletin in response to the killing of the Iranian general.
Amy, good morning. That's right. A stark new bulletin was issued to U.S. law enforcement over the weekend. It's blunt, stating, quote, Iran and its partners such as Hezbollah have demonstrated the intent and capability to conduct operations in the United States. And while no specific plot has been identified, the bulletin pointedly says, quote, an attack in the homeland may come with little or no warning. The bulletin also warns that homegrown radicals may try to take advantage of this tense moment, Amy.
And Pierre, the bulletin also specifically mentions a cyber threat from Iran.
Amy, the Bulletin does emphasize potential Iranian cyber attacks, and we also learned on the night of the attack against the Iranian leader, federal cybersecurity officials reissued a warning about Iran to industry and government agencies. Iranian hackers are quite good at convincing employees to click on links in emails that may look like they're from colleagues or friends, and using that to gain access to take over computer networks. This could lead to problems like denial of service attacks against banks, where customers are blocked from accounts, and there could potentially be disruptions of power, Amy.
All right, Pierre Thomas with the latest from D.C. And of course, we will continue to keep you updated on this all morning long.
صد مرتبه خواندیم ولی باز بخوانیم باید ز سر صدق بر این خاک در افتاد با آل علی هر که در افتاد با آل علی.
Devastation in Australia, where thousands of firefighters and first responders are battling unprecedented wildfires. At least 24 dead, more than 12 million acres destroyed. Ginger is on the scene in Balmoral, Australia with the latest. Good morning, Ginger.
Good morning, George. The people that lived inside this home say they were 30 seconds from becoming a statistic. They had actually put in fire-resistant glass. That's what I'm holding here, just a twisted mess. The metal all twisted. Their home, they said, was just hit by fireballs that just came down and melted it in an instant. I want you to look at this map because that's the map of Australia over the weekend when 200 fires were burning. Just to give you the scope of this, if you put that superimposed on the United States, that would be like fires burning from California to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin to Florida. An unprecedented and early start to fire season here in Australia. Helena Wong and Justin Cam barely made it out of the fire alive.
The total disorientation, your entire life. You know, you feel as though it's yanked out from under you.
That is how thousands of people in Australia feel today. The skies over parts of their nation turned blood orange. So far, 24 people have been killed. We knew the wildfires in California were huge in 2018. And last year, the fires in the Amazon were even bigger. But since September, the fires here in Australia have already burned more than 2 times those events combined.
I asked experts what makes wildfires different here, and it really comes down to the types of trees. We have pines and firs, but here it's all eucalyptus trees, and the eucalyptus oil inside is extremely flammable. Right behind me, a sea of those flammable trees that were extra parched from a driest year on record and the hottest year on record.
More than 4,500 firefighters and support personnel are trying to stop the blazes, including 77 brought in from America. 21 more arriving today.
And they're going to go for a few more months at least.
Even the skies over parts of New Zealand splattered with haze and that orange glow. But this morning, it's Australia's animals who are some of the hardest hit.
There's estimates of hundreds of millions of Australian native species have been killed as a result of this devastating fire.
Reports that as much as half of the island's koala population has been wiped out. The Taronga Zoo in Sydney taking in koala evacuees.
A dozen koalas in here rescued.
That's right.
And this is quarantine, so...
This is a quarantine area, so we're obviously keeping these animals isolated from the rest of the zoo collection.
So we are inside the quarantine where 12 koalas were rescued by Science for Wildlife. Now you have to look right over here. You can see that these females actually have joeys with them. So it was a population they'd been watching for some time. They knew that the fire could potentially take out their habitat, and it did. So it was a good thing they got them out when they did. Now, climate change, arson, and land management are all issues that experts and locals are telling me came together to make this supercharged season. Speaking of the season, we should have just been getting into it. They've still got 2 peak months to go through February. And even though the weather was cooler, a little wetter, and certainly going to be cloudier the next 2 days, by Thursday, Friday, that heat and the extreme low humidities return. Guys.
My goodness, the scale of the fire is just staggering.
Earthquake rocking Puerto Rico, the 5.8 quake striking as people slept, damaging homes, knocking out power, and threatening landslides. It is the latest challenge to the island, still reeling from devastating hurricanes 2 years ago. Here's ABC's Victor Oquendo tonight.
Tonight, Puerto Rico rocked by a 5.8 earthquake. In this neighborhood, houses cracked, shaken right off their foundations. Power poles snapped, stretching across the street. And look at this home. The top floor collapsed, hand-caking both cars parked below. It was one of the strongest quakes to ever hit the U.S. territory, causing small landslides on this highway. Drivers forced to avoid boulders during their morning commute. Officials say tremors have been hitting the area since late December. The quake striking at 6:32 a.m. local time, less than 10 miles off the southwest coast near the major city of Ponce, a place we visited a few months ago. Still so vulnerable more than 2 years since Maria.
Rain coming, a lot of water.
A lot of water comes right inside the house.
More than 13 aftershocks hit today. This station live on the air during one of them. Despite the damage, thankfully, no injuries have been reported. Officials say that people on the southwest side of the island need to remain on high alert. Puerto Rico sits along the border of 2 tectonic plates, so earthquakes are a way of life there. The best advice for anyone whose house was damaged, wait for an engineer to clear it before returning inside. David?
Thinking about everyone in Puerto Rico tonight, Victor, a very tense start to this new year, as tonight American B-52 bombers are now on the move, and thousands of U.S. troops are being deployed to the Middle East as Iran now vows revenge. It all comes, of course, after the death of Iran's top military commander in a U.S. drone strike. And these are the images tonight. Millions in mourning in the streets, the funeral procession in Tehran today. Angry and emotional messages from the Iranian people for the U.S., Iran's supreme leader weeping at the funeral. Tonight, those calls for revenge and chants in Iran's parliament of death to America. Iran effectively now pulling out of the nuclear deal. Tonight, President Trump vowing to answer any retaliation with force. The president speaking of 52 Iranian sites, including sites of cultural significance. And thousands of U.S. troops, many already arriving in the Middle East. You will hear from nervous families right here at home. ABC's Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz leads us off from inside Iran tonight.
In Iran today, an ocean of people taking to the streets. More than 1 million mourners, many dressed in black, grieving the death of General Qasem Soleimani. Numbers not seen since the funeral of an Ayatollah in the 1980s. Soleimani's coffin carried high above their heads today. This procession so packed you can barely move, but the emotion is everywhere. People have a very strong message for America. They are chanting "Death to America." Others here burning the Stars and Stripes. Inside the funeral service, tears from Iran's supreme leader, and amid the grief, calls for revenge.
Trump made a big mistake. He killed our hero. Revenge must happen, and it is certain.
What kind of revenge do you want?
Anything.
Iran promises that is coming. Over the weekend, a red flag symbolizing a declaration of war raised above a mosque. This morning, the Iranian government announcing they are suspending commitments to the 2015 nuclear deal President Trump walked away from months ago. Iran now abandoning limits on enriching uranium and stockpiling nuclear fuel. Members of the Iranian parliament also chanting "Death to America," officials saying retaliation would target the U.S. military. President Trump warns that if there is retaliation, he has 52 Iranian targets in his sights, some, he says, at a very high level and important to Iran and the Iranian culture. Targeting cultural sites is considered a war crime. Today, Iran's president firing back, tweeting those who refer to the number 52 should also remember the number 290, the number of people killed when the U.S. accidentally shot down an Iranian passenger plane in the 80s. Rouhani's message to Trump: never threaten the Iranian nation.
So let's get right to Martha Raddatz, who's with us live tonight from Tehran. And Martha, you and I have both reported from inside Iran, and the Iranian people have often told us that they have felt the U.S.-led sanctions for years. But today I noticed the crowds there with you noting something very different, calling for revenge, and the Iranian government under tremendous pressure tonight to act.
They are, David. The emotion was so high today here, David. We saw many people weeping, but it was mixed with anger and a real desire for revenge, and anger clearly aimed at President Trump. David?
Martha Raddatz leading us off from Tehran tonight. Martha, thank you.
These young American servicemen and women are the first wave of military troops arriving in the Middle East amid the growing crisis with Iran. 3,500 strong, joining the already tens of thousands of U.S. troops in the region. Tensions flaring after a U.S. drone strike last week killed Iran's top military official, General Qasem Soleimani. In the heart of Iran, a public outpouring of grief, overwhelming the streets of its capital.
Trump made a big mistake. He killed our hero.
Cries drowned out by angry chants. Soleimani, a beloved figure in Iran, seen as standing up to the West. Now, his death and the way it was carried out, a game changer for Iran and the United States.
Mr. Trump, you don't have any right to kill him.
My colleague, Martha Raddatz, one of the few Western journalists allowed in the country.
This procession so packed you can barely move, but the emotion is everywhere. People have a very strong message for America.
They're chanting "Death to America." Inside the funeral service, tears from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, weeping and praying over Soleimani's grave.
There are few figures who were held in higher esteem by the Iranian people than Mr. Soleimani. He was the man who brought back pride.
On the ground, his image everywhere. More than 1 million united in their cry for revenge.
Revenge must happen, and it is certain.
What kind of revenge do you want?
Anything.
24-year-old Hussein is a college student.
Soleimani was our hero. They killed him. Why? Is this democracy? Are we human or not? What should we do? You tell us.
What is your message to America?
I'm saying we love Americans, but look at your president.
Soleimani, a critic of the United States, taunted President Trump in a speech in 2018. Let me tell you, Mr. Trump, the gambler, know that we are near you in places that don't come to your mind. The U.S. moved to kill the revered general who commanded the elite Revolutionary Guard, proving consequential across the region. Members of the Iranian parliament chanting "Death to America." And this weekend, an ominous sign, a red flag symbolizing war raised above an Iranian mosque.
We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war.
In the face of criticism, President Trump insisted the attack was a necessary measure.
Soleimani was plotting imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel, but we caught him in the act and terminated him.
But there are questions about the administration's initial justification for the attack, just how imminent those threats were. This evening, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff telling reporters the intelligence was compelling, adding,
"Did it exactly say who, what, when, where? No. But he was planning, coordinating, and synchronizing significant combat operations against U.S. military forces in the region, and it was imminent."
But the Iranians deny those claims, instead pointing to the general's record of fighting ISIS.
آقای ترامپ اگر سندی داشت رو میکرد. آقای ترامپ کاری کرد که خودش و آمریکایی‌ها رو در بین ما.
Iranian officials threatening retaliation that would target U.S. military in the region.
Whether they punch back is a big calculus because they know that if they do, they're going to be hit hard with conventional attacks on Iranian soil. And those attacks could bring down a very fragile economy.
Over the weekend, President Trump warned that if there is retaliation, he has 52 Iranian targets in his sights. Some, he says, at a very high level and important to Iran and the Iranian culture, a potential war crime under international law. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo telling ABC that no illegal action would be taken.
Every target that we strike will be a lawful target, and it will be a target designed at the singular mission of protecting and defending America.
Trump contradicted that notion hours later, telling reporters off camera that Iranians are allowed to kill our people, they're allowed to torture and maim our people, and we're not allowed to touch their cultural sites. It doesn't work that way. Tensions in Iran impacting relations with neighboring Iraq. The Iraqi parliament, angry at the killing of Soleimani on their soil, voting to kick U.S. troops out of the country. Though it's non-binding, it prompted Trump to threaten Iraq with sanctions and demand repayment for the billions of U.S. dollars spent in the country. Amidst this crisis, the U.S. and NATO pausing operations against ISIS. It's worth noting the last time there was a power vacuum in Iraq, ISIS filled the void. This latest round of escalations began in 2018 after President Trump dismantled the Iran nuclear deal, brokered by President Obama.
This was a horrible, one-sided deal.
Today, the Iranian government announcing they're suspending commitments to that deal, now abandoning limits on enriching uranium and stockpiling nuclear fuel. Hostilities continued to escalate after a series of Iranian provocations over this past summer, including the downing of an American drone. Then, in late December, an American contractor was killed in a rocket attack in Iraq. The U.S. blamed an Iranian-backed militia and responded with airstrikes that killed at least 24 people, possibly including civilians. On New Year's Eve, a huge crowd of protesters stormed the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad, breaching the highly fortified perimeter. A 2-day siege sent diplomats into a safe room and forced Marines to deploy tear gas. President Trump blamed Iran for orchestrating those protests, ominously tweeting 2 days before General Soleimani was killed, Iran is going to pay a very big price. This is not a warning, it is a threat. America's contentious history with Iran goes back decades, back to 1953, when the U.S. installed the Shah in order to protect oil interests. After 25 years, in 1979, mass demonstrations filled the streets and forced the Shah into exile. Then, just months later,
the U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students,
holding dozens of American hostages for 444 days. before they were released in 1981. The relationship between the U.S. and Iran over the next few decades would remain fractured. Fast forward to 2013. President Barack Obama's administration started taking small but controversial steps to bridge decades of hostilities, including a one-on-one conversation with Iran's then newly elected President Rouhani. In 2015, the U.S., along with a group of world powers, brokered the deal with Iran to end its nuclear program. That momentary thawing of tensions, now history. What happens next? Unknown.
And we'll have much more coverage continuing on.